Hey YouTube, a while ago I made a leather holster for a Hammershot style Nerf gun. While this video is intended as less of a tutorial and more entertainment, I'm sure that the right person could probably get some sort of inspiration from the methods or style of what I've done. But just bear in mind I'm not actually going to be walking through it step by step. Anyway, this was a lot of fun to make and I'm very proud of the end result. So let's jump straight into it. I started out by making a paper prototype. This bit took quite a long time with a lot of slight changes since I wanted to make sure that my pattern was as good as it possibly could be before I committed to cutting anything out. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. When I was finally ready to make the first cut, I lined up the pattern as best I could onto my leather and gathered my tools. After tracing the pattern, I carefully cut the piece of leather out. That was the easy part. I'll let past me explain some of the pattern creation process and the plan for tooling. This was filmed in pre-pandemic 2020 and I'd like to point out that past me rocked the season 2 Yes Gear haircut before it was cool. So that's one nice piece of leather cut. Backing up a little bit as to how I actually got this pattern in the first place, I initially started by sketching around the Hammershot that I'm planning to use. Finding something that kind of fit roughly right. The actual kind of pattern bit was hardest because most holster patterns are for real guns and I'm definitely not making it for a real gun. Once I had this rough pattern, I took my neat pattern. I then played around with it a little bit more. Made some really smooth lines which would look nice at the front. This one doesn't have those little straps connected to it because I'm planning on doing that separately. I think it would work a lot better if I just connected it via rivets, and I thought that having it connected on here would make it harder to cut out the actual pattern. Of course you'll notice this bit's a bit empty. I'm going to cut a bit of leather that will fit in here after I've kind of figured out how this will sew together. I might even do the stitches on this part before I do this part, I'm not sure. I'll have to figure out what's easiest. And then of course I'm going to want some kind of pattern for the front, which brings me to this friendly book, which by turn of fate I actually ended up getting with my leather making tools along with this book over here, which is extremely useful. So the next bit would be to make the edges on this a little bit neater, and then I can start tooling this pattern in. I'm not sure how well it shows up, but that is a cougar. It's a little bit more ambitious than what I did previously, so hopefully it works out. In order to get the right sizing for the cougar, which actually, to be honest, I just sketched it from this book and it turned out to be the right size, but to make sure it was the right size, I sketched out a little half. I'm not sure what that's showing up. I sketched out a little half of the holster on here, and I just made sure that it could fit over it on the tracing paper. Oh, I wouldn't put the feet in here because it might seem soft, but it's not. Oh, hey, would you mind not standing on that? That's my tracing paper. Just don't scrunch it, it'll be fine. I'm not going to trick myself into thinking this is going to be easy to carve, because I know it's not. Alright, now to find out what I've forgotten to trace. Oh yeah, that looks pretty darn good. So this is after tracing but before cutting. The harder lines I'm going to cut and hopefully they'll look alright because a lot of them are quite intricate and small. The dotted lines are more for when I come to actually doing the tooling, so I know where to go down a bit more for. Fingers crossed I'll be able to do justice to it. The most hair-raising part of this project was the tooling. With something so intricate, it would only take a small misjudgment to mess up the picture. I actually got it to this point and then took a break for 3 months. Firstly, because it was going too well and I procrastinated in case I messed something up, but also because that was about when the pandemic started and I lost my motivation for a bit. However, the beauty of video is we don't have to wait to see the finished tooling. So here we find ourselves in late November 2020 with the tooling just finished and the stitching holes just about to go in. Prior to making the stitching holes, I had marked the line they'd follow so they'd stay straight. Finishing the tooling wasn't as hard as I'd feared. I took it slowly and carefully and ultimately didn't film that bit because it needed my full attention and camera angles are hard. Here's a good shot of the finished tooling and stitch holes. After a quick check for fit, I cut the straps and added all the holes. Before I could get to adding any rivets or sewing, it was time to dye and finish the leather. It's worth noting that I still hadn't cut the base of the holster at this point. Since it was such a specific shape, it was going to be a lot easier to cut once the holster was partially sewed. Because my character in the LARP I'm making this for predominantly wears black, I opted for a black holster with silver buckles. I used an oak leaf stamp on the buckles for a nice uniform pattern prior to dyeing them. Yet another bonus goodie I got from the guy I bought my tools from. Facebook Marketplace is feral, but for my one experience of using it, I would say that I ended up extremely lucky. This was the first time I'd sewed leather, and although it was a little cramped, it wasn't too hard to sew down the side. I paused the sewing for a moment to add the straps, and to be honest, I would have left them for later had I realised just how difficult the last bit of sewing would be. It wouldn't have made the sewing itself easier, however it would have been one less thing to worry about without the straps getting in the way. Again, not something I videoed, but to get the bottom shape, I first cut a piece of paper into the right size, then I cut the leather you see me working on and wet formed it into the existing shape of the holster. When it dried, it held its shape throughout the dyeing process, and that made it easier to fit into place and handle. Sewing that little bit on was enough to make me swear off sewing leather again. I took each end of the thread and sewed up each side until the stitches met. Let me tell you, I broke something like 4 needles, stabbed myself multiple times with the super sharp leather needles, scratched up my knuckles trying to manoeuvre in that tiny cramped space. All that aside, it did come out looking rather nice. In the end, I painted the Nerf gun super simply, since I think I started painting it something like the day before I needed it. But here it is all together, minus the belt of course, but the belt would go in this little spot over here. As you can see, it came out looking pretty good. I am super proud of how this came out. It's honestly about as good as I could expect it to get. Especially since I took on such a difficult pattern so new into leatherworking. Credit where credit is due for the super helpful book that had the pattern in it. one of the most helpful parts of that was the breakdown of tooling and how to kind of approach something so intricate but layering it so that it wasn't overwhelming. I will put the books that I used in the description of this video. I'm not sure how easy they are to get these days because I think one of them was published quite a long time ago. However, I think it's still worth, if you've got the chance to actually have some kind of reference, to use it. At least I found it very useful as a beginner leather tooler. Right, that's it for me. I do have more projects in the works and I might eventually share them with YouTube. But for now, bye.